Imagine that you are 12 years old. Perhaps you are Greek, Syrian, or from Thrace. Your family could not feed you, or maybe you were captured during a war. It does not matter how you arrived here. You are now standing on a wooden platform in the Roman Forum, completely without clothes. A small sign hangs from your neck. It displays your age, your place of origin, and your physical characteristics. Buyers walk around you. You feel hands on your body, touching, squeezing, and examining you as if you were livestock. One person forces your mouth open to inspect your teeth. Another squeezes your arms. Fingers comb through your hair. You want to cover yourself, but it is impossible. You want to run, but where could you go? You are not being sold to the mines, the fields, or the arena. You are considered beautiful, your skin is soft, your hair curly, your features delicate. And in Rome, this means your future will be far worse than most. There was a specific type of slave in Rome that history rarely mentions. They were called Delicatus, young male slaves chosen for their appearance, purchased by senators, emperors, and the wealthiest members of society. What happened to them is shocking, and it is almost never described in textbooks. This is the reality of being a young and favored slave in Imperial Rome. If you want to learn more about the hidden and brutal truths that history often hides, continue watching, because what you are about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about Roman civilization. The largest slave market in Rome was located at the Forum Boarium, near the Tiber River. Hundreds of slaves arrived each day, prisoners of war, children sold by poor families, and captives brought from distant provinces. But not all slaves were valued equally. A slave for the fields could cost between 500 and 5,800 denarii. Slaves for the mines were even cheaper. They were considered tools, meat for labor. But a 12-year-old Greek boy with curly hair, fair skin, and delicate features could cost more than 10,000 denarii, more than 3 years of a soldier's salary. These boys were not purchased to perform labor. They were purchased to be displayed, to serve at lavish banquets, or to reside in the private rooms of senators and emperors. The Romans had a specific term for such slaves, delicatus. It meant favored, refined, delicate, but the reality was far from kind. Imagine a wealthy senator walking through the market, ignoring hundreds of slaves who are too old, scarred, or unfit. Then he notices a boy, perhaps 11 or 13, with smooth skin and a graceful posture. He examines every detail, turning the boy, speaking to him, asking, "Has he been trained?" The dealer nods. Fresh from Galatia, untouched. The transaction is completed. 12,000 denarii. A high price, but for the child, it seals a fate from which there is no escape. Being purchased does not mean freedom. It does not mean safety. It means entering a world that will change you forever. Being a delicatus did not mean living a life of comfort. It meant belonging entirely to someone else. Your body, your time, your entire existence was no longer your own. For some, the situation became even more horrifying: castration. Castrated slaves were called Spadonis. Contrary to popular belief, this practice was not exclusive to the East. Rome did it as well. Officially, Roman law, under the Lex Cornelia, banned castration. But laws in Rome only applied to those who were not rich or powerful. The senators, governors, and even emperors ignored these laws when it suited them. Why did they do it? Absolute control. A castrated slave could not reproduce, could not form a family, and could owe loyalty to no one except his master. He became property in the most complete sense. Castration before puberty preserved the physical features the elite most desired: soft skin, a high-pitched voice, and delicate, almost childlike appearance. Imagine you are that boy, purchased just days ago and placed in your new master's house. You do not speak Latin well. You do not understand what is about to happen. Two men enter your room. They restrain you. You scream. No one comes to help. What happens next will forever change your life. The procedure was horrific. There were two main methods. The first, called crushing, involved tightly binding a cord around the scrotum, cutting off blood flow until the tissue died and fell off. Infection and prolonged suffering were common. The second method involved using a bronze knife to remove the testicles entirely, without any form of anesthesia, followed by cauterization of the wound with a red-hot iron. Mortality rates were extremely high, between 60 and 90%. Most boys did not survive the first week. Those who survived retained their childlike features, their voices never deepened, facial hair never grew, and their bodies remained forever between childhood and adulthood. This was precisely what their masters desired. Boys from regions such as Cappadocia, Galatia, and Syria were particularly valued because specialists there had slightly better survival rates. Roman writers like Juvenal and Tacitus criticized Eastern nations for practicing castration, calling it a sign of effeminacy and decadence. Yet, Roman emperors filled their own palaces with castrated boys. The hypocrisy was complete. Rome condemned others for the exact practices it carried out within its own elite circles. Some emperors, such as Emperor Domitian, even banned castration publicly while raising the price of castrated slaves, not out of compassion, but to control the market and increase their value. Writers described these boys in poetic terms: voices like flutes, skin like marble. Beautiful words hid the horrific reality. Rome transformed torture into art, and people believed it. The most famous case is that of Sporus, a young slave whose life reveals the full brutality and moral contradictions of Roman society. The stories of these boys remind us that behind the grandeur of Rome, unimaginable cruelty thrived. One of the most infamous cases of a young Delicatus slave involves a boy named Sporus, who was discovered by Emperor Nero around the year 65 CE. According to the historian Suetonius, Nero was obsessed with Sporus because the boy strongly resembled his deceased wife, Pompeia Sabina. The emperor took an extreme action, even by Roman standards. He ordered Sporus to be castrated and then completely transformed. Sporus was dressed in women's clothing, adorned with jewelry, and made up as a Roman matron. His hair was styled in the fashion of noble Roman women. In a public ceremony with witnesses present, Nero married him. He even gave Sporus the name Sabina, after his dead wife. Imagine the spectacle: the Emperor of Rome walking through the Forum with a castrated teenage boy dressed as a woman, holding his hand, kissing him publicly, and referring to him as "my beloved Sabina." Everyone was forced to comply. Senators, generals, and the entire imperial court had to play along. Sporus accompanied Nero everywhere. He sat beside him at public events, lived in the imperial palace, and appeared at state functions as though he were the emperor's wife. This was not a relationship of love or affection, it was a demonstration of absolute power. Nero had the authority to take a human being, reshape him completely, change his body, his identity, and his reality, forcing him to perform a role for the entire empire. After Nero's death in 68 CE, Sporus passed into the possession of Emperor Otho, who had also been infatuated with Pompeia. Later, Sporus was inherited by Emperor Vitellius, who reportedly intended to have him assaulted and killed in the arena. Sporus was treated as property, passed from emperor to emperor like a valuable object, not a person. 3 emperors owned him, and none regarded him as human. Many sources indicate that Sporus eventually chose to take his own life rather than continue enduring such treatment. He preferred death to another day living as an object of power and desire. Sporus was not an isolated example. Roman literature contains many accounts of Delicatus slaves, young boys whose lives revolved around serving and being displayed for the elite. The historian Martial mentions Ararinus, a boy who served in a wealthy household. Poets wrote about his beauty, framing it as romantic, but in truth, Ararinus was property, not a partner. Another example is Glaucius, described by Status, who died young. His death was mourned as if a beautiful object had been lost rather than a human life. These boys often lived in imperial palaces or private villas, in luxurious quarters with fine clothing and abundant food. Yet, despite appearances of privilege, they were never free. From childhood, they were trained in music, poetry, and dance. Their existence was carefully curated to be always refined, always presentable. Their day began when their master awoke and ended only when he went to sleep, sometimes even later. They had no privacy, no time to themselves, and no autonomy over their own bodies. Imagine your life in this system. It is 3 o'clock in the morning. A bell rings. Your master desires wine. You rise immediately from wherever you were resting and serve him. He is accompanied by guests, intoxicated and crude. They comment openly on your body, your face, and what they would like to do to you. You remain silent. You do not speak unless spoken to, because that is what you are now, a living decoration, a beautiful object in a room filled with powerful men who regard you as less than human. The Roman court was a place of political intrigue, favoritism, and sudden shifts in power. Being close to the emperor could bring privileges, but it also meant constant danger. Suetonius recounts that under Emperor Tiberius, the villa at Capri became associated with disturbing rumors. Young slaves, some as young as 7 or 8, were reportedly used in ways that shocked Roman society. Tiberius allegedly had boys, referred to as little fish, swim in pools around him. While some accounts may reflect political bias, the repeated consistency of these reports suggests a real pattern of abuse. Tacitus also mentions a prominent Roman accused of mistreating his Delicatus slaves. The case was brought to trial, not because the law protected the children, but because he had offended elite families. The slaves themselves had no legal standing, their testimony was not even considered. Here is the cruelest paradox: these slaves were highly visible but completely voiceless. They appeared at public banquets, walked the marble halls in fine garments, and were constantly on display. Everyone could see them. Everyone could admire, or exploit, them. Yet they had no rights, no freedom, and no way to defend themselves. They were beauty in motion, living objects whose lives were dictated entirely by the whims of the powerful. These young boys could be adorned with fine clothing, jewelry, and live in rooms filled with gold, yet they had absolutely no agency. They could reside in luxurious quarters and be admired by thousands, but they were never free. They were regarded as objects, not people. Roman society, deeply obsessed with status, image, and appearances, did not see this as a problem. Instead, it was considered a mark of elite privilege. To own a beautiful young slave was to demonstrate wealth and power. To display such a slave publicly was to signal status. To alter the body of that slave, shaping it to fit elite desires, was a demonstration of dominance. The feelings, desires, and basic humanity of these boys were completely irrelevant. What makes this even more shocking is the hypocrisy of Rome. Roman writers and society frequently criticized Eastern cultures for their use of castrated slaves, known as Spadonis, portraying the practice as barbaric, effeminate, and a sign of moral decay. Tacitus, for example, expressed disgust at the courts of the East, presenting these practices as proof that Rome was superior, more masculine, and morally virtuous. Juvenal mocked the use of castrated servants in Persia and Egypt, calling it a perversion of nature. And yet, at the very same time, Roman emperors were filling their own courts with Spadonis, many imported from those same eastern regions they criticized. The law, under the Lex Cornelia, technically banned castration, but enforcement was non-existent if the perpetrator was wealthy. Elite Romans could act with complete impunity. Emperors like Domitian raised the price of Spadonis not to prevent the practice, but to control it and increase the value of the castrated boys they owned. Hadrian maintained his own favorites, including Antinous. Nero's public relationship with Sporus was widely known, and yet Roman writers continued to present Rome as morally superior. This contradiction was deliberate. Rome needed to see itself as the pinnacle of civilization, the bringer of law and order, and the height of human achievement. Behind the marble columns, public speeches, and proclamations about Roman virtue, however, the empire was built on systematic exploitation and cruelty. Young boys were bought and sold like livestock. Their bodies were altered to fit the desires of the elite and displayed as symbols of wealth, while every fundamental human right was denied to them. A Roman senator could stand in the Forum and speak of dignitas, honor, and the glory of Rome, and then return to his private quarters and treat his Delicatus slave with brutality. The same hands that gestured while talking about civilization were used to dominate and exploit the children under their ownership. All of this occurred while Rome lectured the world about law, order, and morality. This is what happens when a society decides that some human beings do not count. When wealth and power are valued above basic dignity, The young slaves of Imperial Rome are a chilling reminder that even the most civilized societies can hide immense cruelty behind beauty, art, law, and ritual. These boys' voices were silenced, their stories barely recorded, and most remain nameless. Yet their experiences deserve remembrance, not to shame anyone today, but to show that human rights are never guaranteed. Civilization can be only a thin veneer over barbarity, and the powerful will always find ways to justify the exploitation of the powerless if we allow it. Every time you see a statue of a Roman emperor or a painting depicting a banquet, remember that Delicatus slaves were likely present in that room. Boys whose names we will never know, whose faces we will never see, whose stories were never told, but who were just as human as anyone else. Rome did not fall solely because of barbarians at the gates. Rome fell, in part, because a society that treated human beings like decorative objects was never truly civilized. The marble was always hiding blood. If this opened your eyes to a side of Rome that is never taught in schools, consider hitting the like button and subscribing for more unflinching historical truths. Share in the comments what shocked you the most. Every one of these stories reminds us that history is full of uncomfortable truths, but those truths are exactly why we must continue to study and talk about it.